It was one of those gray New York afternoons when the city felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. Overcast skies loomed low, and the streets of Brooklyn glistened from a recent drizzle. Steve Rogers walked with no particular destination, just a habit he'd never broken. A shield across his back, a hoodie over his head. The world had mostly stopped pointing fingers and taking pictures. Mostly. He turned a corner onto Fulton Avenue, where a small crowd had gathered outside a corner store. Tension hung in the air. "What's going on?" Steve asked, approaching slowly. A store clerk shook his head. "Some kid tried to steal food. Security locked him in. Cops are on their way." Steve stepped closer to the glass. Inside, behind an overturned display of cereal boxes, sat a teenage boy. Dirt on his cheeks, eyes wild with fear. Thin jacket, no bag. He couldn't be more than 15. Steve signaled to the clerk. "Let me talk to him." The man hesitated, then stepped aside. Steve entered the store, the bell jingling with a sad little chime. The boy looked up fast, his body tense, ready to bolt. "Easy," Steve said, kneeling beside a fallen shelf. "Not here to hurt you." The boy stared, eyes squinting. Then his jaw dropped. "Dad?" Steve froze. "What did you say?" The boy stood up slowly, shaking now. I thought, I mean, you look like him. The picture? From Mom's box." Steve's chest tightened. "I'm not," he began, but stopped. The boy took a cautious step forward. "You're him, aren't you? My mom said my dad fought in the war, that he was a hero. She said if I ever found him, I'd know." Steve tried to process. His voice stayed calm. "What's your name, kid?" "Dylan. Dylan Parks." The name hit Steve like a ripple from the past. Parks. He knew that name. Private William Parks, 107th Infantry, Normandy. Steve had pulled him from under a collapsed Jeep, bleeding out, whispering his wife's name. They'd gotten him out. Barely. Steve hadn't seen him again. He cleared his throat. "I knew a Parks. Your dad. A good man." Dylan's face lit up, hope flooding his eyes. "So, it's true?" Steve stood slowly. "Come with me. We'll talk somewhere warmer." The store clerk stepped aside as Steve led Dylan out, one hand on the boy's shoulder. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Steve waved them off with a glance. They sat on a bench 3 blocks away, under a canopy dripping with water. Dylan unwrapped a half-squished protein bar from his pocket and offered half. Steve shook his head. "You eat." For a while, the only sound was chewing and the rhythm of passing cars. Dylan finally spoke. "I didn't mean to steal. No one's gonna hire a kid who sleeps in stairwells." Steve looked at him. "How long's it been since you had a place?" "Couple months, after Mom died. Foster stuff didn't stick." Steve exhaled. The weight of it settled in his gut. "You still have that picture?" he asked. Dylan nodded and pulled a folded photo from his pocket. It was torn, faded, an old Army group shot. In the back, Steve's younger self stood beside Parks, both men in uniform, both smiling like war was just another day at the office. Steve stared at it for a long time. "He really talked about me?" he asked softly. Dylan nodded. "Said you saved his life, that if he didn't make it home, I should look for the man with the shield." Steve closed his eyes for a second. "I'm not your father, Dylan," he said finally, "but I did fight beside him, and I never forgot him." Dylan didn't answer right away. He just looked at the street, expression unreadable. "You don't have to be him," the boy said. "I just didn't want to be alone tonight." Steve reached into his coat and handed the kid a card. "Name and address of a place I trust. They'll get you cleaned up, fed and warm." Dylan hesitated. "Will you come back?" Steve looked at him. "I don't make promises unless I keep them." And for the first time in a long time, Steve Rogers didn't feel like a soldier or a symbol or a leader. He just felt human. The shelter wasn't much. A warm cot, clean socks, and food that didn't come out of a vending machine. But to Dylan, it was more than enough. Steve stood at the doorway, watching as the boy carefully folded his jacket and placed it on the bed like it was sacred. The kid had manners. Not taught, but earned. The kind that came from fighting to stay human when the world tried to make you feel invisible. He doesn't say much, said the shelter nurse beside Steve. But he's polite. Said you were family. Steve looked down. Something like that. Later that night, Steve sat alone at his Brooklyn apartment. The lights were low. His shield rested against the wall. And in front of him, on the table, lay a manila folder labeled Parks, William, 107th INF. He opened it slowly. Photographs, field reports, a handwritten letter from William's wife tucked into a ration envelope. Steve read each line like it was etched in stone. If I don't make it home, tell our boy I was brave. Tell him I stood beside Captain America. Steve closed the file and leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He had stood beside William, but who was standing beside Dylan? The next morning, Steve returned to the shelter. Dylan was already up, sitting at the window, knees hugged to his chest. You came back, he said. I said I would. Dylan turned. They said I could stay a week, but then I gotta go. Steve sat across from him. You don't have any other family? Dylan shook his head. They didn't want me, not after Mom passed. Steve studied him. Same eyes as his father, same stubborn chin, and something else, the same quiet strength. You ever box? Steve asked. Dylan raised an eyebrow. What? Your dad was a scrappy fighter. Wouldn't shut up about footwork. You ever throw a punch? Once, Dylan muttered. Broke my own nose. Steve chuckled. You want to learn for real? Dylan blinked. You serious? Steve stood. There's a gym 2 blocks over. No capes, no cameras, just gloves and grit. That afternoon, they stood inside an old training hall with cracked walls and the smell of leather and sweat. Steve handed Dylan gloves. Lesson 1. You're not punching people. You're learning to stand your ground. Dylan nodded, slipping them on. They trained. Jab, pivot, breathe. Between drills, they talked. Awkward at first, then easier. About music, baseball, what it felt like to be looked at like you didn't belong. Dylan asked, Were you always brave? Steve paused. Number I was just too small to run away. Dylan smiled. Guess that's something we have in common. After the gym, they sat on a bench eating greasy takeout. You don't act like how people say you do, Dylan said. Steve raised an eyebrow. How's that? You're not loud. You're not perfect. Steve smiled faintly. Good. Can I ask something weird? Sure. Dylan looked down at his food. Even if you're not my dad, can I pretend you are? Just until I figure things out? Steve didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, You can pretend all you want, but you don't have to. Dylan looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, he didn't see a hero. He saw someone who showed up, and that was enough. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge. Steve moved through the kitchen like he had done it 100 times before, except this time, there was a second set of footsteps, smaller, lighter. Dylan. He sat at the table, thumbing through an old National Geographic Steve had left out. He had been staying with Steve for 3 nights now. They had a rhythm, morning jog, simple dinners, evening chats that started clumsy and ended honest. Steve handed him a plate of eggs. Eat. You're growing. Dylan smirked. I'm 15. You say that like it's a full-grown adult. Feels like it. Steve sat across from him, sipping coffee. He didn't say it aloud, but Dylan had been right about one thing. It felt like something. That afternoon, Dylan asked to see the shield. Steve hesitated. It's just metal, right? Dylan asked. Steve walked into the hallway closet and brought it out. Vibranium. Scarred from battles most people had forgotten, but it still shimmered with the weight of memory. Dylan touched it with both hands. It's heavier than it looks. It always is. That night, Dylan didn't come to the table for dinner. Steve found him in the living room, sitting on the floor, laptop open in his lap. The screen glowed with a photo, a black and white military record. William Parks, KIA, 1945. Next to it, an image of Steve Rogers, his age frozen in time. Dylan didn't look up. You lied. Steve froze. I didn't lie, he said slowly. I just didn't tell you everything. You let me believe. Dylan's voice cracked. You let me think you could be my father. Steve stepped forward. I never said that. But you didn't stop me either. Silence. Steve sat down across from him. Your father was my friend. He saved my life more than once. And when he talked about you and your mom, he sounded like a man who already knew he wouldn't make it home. Dylan's eyes burned. So that letter, that story about him calling you brother, it was all true? Steve nodded. All of it. Then why didn't you come find me? The question hit like a punch. Steve stared at the floor. Because I didn't know. And when I finally did, I didn't think I deserved to. Dylan's breath hitched. You're Captain America. You deserve everything. Steve shook his head. Not this, not him, not you. Dylan looked down. So what am I supposed to do now? Steve leaned forward. You're supposed to live, to get up every day and remember that your dad loved you more than life itself, and that I will never let you be forgotten again. Dylan swallowed hard. I don't need a superhero. Steve's voice lowered. Neither did he. He needed someone to have his back. I couldn't be there in the end, but I can be here now. The boy wiped his eyes and stood. He didn't say anything as he walked into the guest room and shut the door. And Steve sat alone, staring at the shield leaning by the wall. For the first time, it felt like it didn't belong to a symbol. It belonged to a man still trying to make things right. The morning sun crept across the hardwood floor in soft golden strips. Steve stood in the kitchen holding 2 mugs, 1 coffee, 1 hot cocoa. He waited, but Dylan didn't come out of his room. Not at first. When he finally did, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were still red from the night before. Steve handed him the cocoa without a word. Dylan took it, sat down, stared into the steam like it held every answer he didn't know how to ask. I packed a bag, he said finally. Steve didn't react. Where you headed? Not sure. There's a youth housing center in Queens. They've got art classes. You like art? Dylan shrugged. It's quiet, doesn't lie. Steve nodded slowly. You'll be good at it. Dylan glanced at him. You're not going to stop me? Steve shook his head. I'm just glad you're choosing where to go next, not just surviving. They sat in silence. Then Dylan reached into his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it towards Steve. Steve opened it slowly. It was a drawing, rough, done in pencil, the lines pressed too hard in some places, too soft in others. But it was clear. A tall figure, shield on his back, crouched beside a young boy. Not fighting, not saving, just being there. Underneath, in shaky block letters, it read, You were never just filling space. Steve's throat tightened. Dylan stood. You're still not my dad. I know, but you're the closest I've ever had. Steve stood too. I'll always be around. You don't even have to call. Dylan smiled faintly. You'll just show up? Every time. They walked to the subway together. No fanfare, no flag waving. Just a man and a boy. At the station entrance, Dylan stopped. He turned, hesitated, then wrapped his arms around Steve in a fast, awkward hug. Steve returned it without hesitation. Tight, steady, honest. I'll send you my next drawing, Dylan said. I'll frame it. And with that, the boy disappeared into the crowd. Steve returned home and pinned the drawing to his wall, right above his medals, right beside a faded photo of William Parks. He looked at both for a long time. He didn't need applause. He didn't need closure. All he needed was this one moment, this one reminder. Sometimes the greatest legacy is simply being there when someone needs to believe in you. And as the city roared back to life outside his window, Steve Rogers sat quietly in the sunlight. Still a soldier, still a shield, but more than anything, still someone's hero.